The National Rifle Association has been in support of workable, enforceable gun control legislation since its very inception in 1871. NRA Executive Vice President Franklin L. Orth, NRA's American Rifleman magazine, March 1968. The Second Amendment to the Constitution provides all Americans with an unconditional right to keep and bear arms. Any attempt to modify or restrict gun ownership is therefore unconstitutional. That is the claim of conservatives. The reality: the right to keep and bear arms is not at all unconditional. The Constitution plainly asserts that gun ownership is subject to regulation by the U.S. House of Representatives, in other words, the federal government. It is only since the 1970s that this has been a matter of controversy at all. Until that time, the nation's largest and most influential gun rights organization, the National Rifle Association, consistently supported a variety of gun control laws, including registration, waiting periods, and outright bans on certain types of firearms. The framers of the Constitution predicated the right of citizens to keep and bear arms on the necessity of having a citizen army ready to defend the country in case of insurrection or foreign invasion. These militias were to be organized by the individual states, but very definitely under the authority of Congress. A plain reading of the Second Amendment makes this abundantly clear, so let's take a look at the complete text of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Note the words well-regulated. It would be surprising if the founders had used the phrase well-regulated in a sentence that was actually intended to prohibit regulation. But of course, the Second Amendment does not prohibit regulation. It does the very opposite by establishing the principle of federal regulation of state militias as the essential basis for granting citizens the right to keep and bear arms. We should note that the word state in the text of the Second Amendment refers to the nation as a whole rather than the individual states of the Union. The words state and country are interchangeable, as James Madison actually demonstrated in an earlier draft of the Second Amendment. Quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country," unquote. Most public discussions about gun rights begin and end with the Second Amendment, but to fully understand the original intent of the framers, one also has to read the main body of the Constitution, which unambiguously asserts that state militias are subordinate to the federal government, specifically Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16, which states, "The Congress shall have the power to provide for calling forth the militia, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections and repel invasions, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Note the words well-regulated, organizing, disciplining, governing, in the service of the United States, and according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. These words and phrases don't exactly suggest a paramount concern with limiting the regulatory powers of the federal government. And indeed, at the time the Constitution was being written and debated, anti-federalists who opposed the Constitution fretted over exactly this point. They objected to a Constitution that empowered the federal government over the individual states. Their objections against federal control of state militias demonstrate the fact that the militias were never intended by the founders to be state-controlled, but were, on the contrary, intended to be subject to the federal government. Consider, for example, anti-federalist Patrick Henry's objections. Quote, "Let me here call your attention to that part which gives the Congress power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia, or according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. By this, sir, you see that their control over our last and best defense is unlimited. If they neglect or refuse to discipline or arm our militia, they will be useless. The states can do neither, this power being exclusively given to Congress. The power of appointing officers over men not disciplined or armed is ridiculous, so that this pretended little remains of power left to the states may, at the pleasure of Congress, be rendered negatory." Quote, unquote. Henry's words make absolutely no sense unless we recognize, as he did, that the framers of the Constitution intended gun ownership to be tightly regulated by the federal government. Patrick Henry may well have agreed with today's gun rights advocates, but he was speaking against the Constitution and not in favor of it. In other words, today's radical pro-gun position is so far from being constitutional that it perfectly aligns with the views of those who vehemently opposed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights itself. There is no discussion anywhere in the Constitution of a right to keep and bear arms except in the context of a well-regulated militia. Therefore, regardless of any and all disputes about the extent to which state militias are subject to regulation by the federal government, there is simply and clearly no basis in the Constitution from which to infer an unconditional right of individual citizens to possess any weapons for any purpose.